Hello and welcome back to That Age 12. This week I'm joined for a third time with Marc Morris. The last time we discussed the Norman conquest, and before that the Anglo-Saxon. And this week we are going to discuss Edward the First. Of course, she has written a biography on which I'm holding up here in this beautiful paperback version. And before we begin discussing Edward the First, and as you wrote about in and I myself am guilty of this, there is a big confusion because he's not really the first Edward who has held the title of king. So there's of
No,
course
well,
Edward.
He's
There's of
first
course Edward the
Edward after the
Confessor.
Norman
So
Conquest.
yeah. So let's
Yeah,
discuss a little bit the confusion now.
he's the first Edward after the Norman Conquest. There hadn't been an Edward. The last Edward in England's history was Edward the Confessor, who died in 1066, at the start of 1066. And so it was 170 odd years since there'd been a King Edward. And for obvious reasons, none of the pre-conquest English kings have been hero worshipped by their Norman successors. So the Normans, in the first instance, called their sons good French names like William, Henri, Richard, etc. And it was the enthusiasm of Edward I's father, Henry III, for the cult of Edward the Confessor that prompted him to name his firstborn son Edward. So it is an Old English name, which is brought back into service unexpectedly by the enthusiasm of Henry III for that particular saint. He does the same with his second son as well. His second son is called Edmund, after the 9th century Old English martyr, King Edmund. So we get a couple of names there which are brought back into play. But as you say, there have been earlier King Edwards. Edward the Confessor was one, Edward the Martyr was another. So no, it depends how you count, but he is not technically the first Edward. The reason the numbering starts in the 13th century is largely because of Edward's successors, because as you know, his only surviving son is also called Edward. And then Edward II calls his firstborn son calls his firstborn son Edward as well. So you get 3 consecutive Edwards, which meant that by the middle of the 14th century, it was very difficult for contemporaries to distinguish. And they started to refer to them as, do you mean the first one, the second one, or the third one? So they started to give them numbers. And that's really where the numbering of English kings begins, is in the 14th century with those Edwards.
So let's begin with his birth and in 1239. And if I may say so, didn't seem like a happy family upbringing, and it was, as we will see that later, there was a bit of a family feud, as well as doesn't seem to be too uncommon in the Plantagenet dynasty line.
No, I think Edward's domestic life, his immediate family, was happy enough. It's not the sort of dysfunctional family you see a generation or two earlier with Henry II and his sons. So I think Edward is very close to his father and his mother. And I think his upbringing is pretty stable. I mean, he doesn't really venture very far from Windsor Castle or Westminster. So I'd say his and politically, the early 1240s, they're relatively stable. What I think you're alluding to in terms of the I suppose the upset or the chaotic elements that come in is in his wider family, because Henry, Edward's father, has half brothers from southern France who turn up in the mid to late 1240s, and they fall out with the family of his queen, Eleanor of Provence, and so there is rivalry, very bitter rivalry, that upsets English politics between these two different groups of foreign courtiers, that eventually provokes a political revolution when Edward is about 18 or 19. So on the one hand, his own immediate family, that's fine, and he hasn't got the same antagonism with his father and mother that you find in earlier English reigns. For example, William the Conqueror and his sons, or Henry II and his sons. But it's Edward's wider circle of relatives that are the ones who are feuding with each other by 1258.
Let's talk about, because he do go this is what perhaps what I find fascinating, that he did decide to go on a holy war in his youth as well, and go to the Holy Land to fight a crusade of all things. Then it's the same problem with taxation and cost of the war that we find in Richard Lionheart's time, that he taxed the land heavily for to be able to afford to go on this holy war. But as you write about it, it does seem to be a popular choice, and it does become popular. Seem become quite popular because he decided to go on this crusade to the Holy Land.
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting sort of signal here to say the internet connection's a bit unstable, and I didn't get all of your question, but we're talking about Edward's crusade. So perhaps we should sort of just talk a little bit about the breakdown of politics in 1258. So when we get to 1258, Henry III is deprived of power effectively by his baronage, by a portion of his baronage who get tired of the setting aside of the rule book when it comes to Henry's Lusignan half-brothers, and all kinds of other policy mistakes that Henry has made, which reveal his kingship to be inept, basically. So Henry is deprived of power by this council, and that puts Edward in a very difficult position, because on the one hand, he is good friends with some of his Lusignan half-uncles, and on the other hand, he's a sort of an idealistic young man who's drawn in some ways to aspects of the reform that's being proposed by the critics of Henry's government. So it's a very, very complicated period for 6 or 7 years, 7 or 8 years of Henry's reign, where Edward seems to be, if you were being unfair or judging it very quickly, you say, well, he's constantly changing sides, but the sides are forever changing themselves, and the political groupings are forever shifting. It's a very kaleidoscopic court. But that concludes that period with 2 great battles. 1264, when Henry and Edward, who were fighting together at that point, are defeated by Simon de Montfort. Simon de Montfort, Henry's brother-in-law, one of the leading reformers / rebels, and Edward is imprisoned. And then when Edward escapes the following year, he is by this point in his mid-20s. He is the figure around whom the royalists rally and defeat Montfort in battle at the Battle of Evesham in Worcestershire. So that's a very quick sketch of the political breakdown that happens when Edward is in his early 20s, late teens, early 20s, which does do a lot to inform the rest of his reign. To move on to the Crusade, I think to the alarm of a lot of people, Edward decides in the wake of this very divisive civil war that he and his friends are going to go to the Holy Land on crusade. And as you say, this is a tradition that goes back, obviously in some respects, to the First Crusade of the late 11th century. But also it harkens back to the more recent crusade of his great uncle, Richard the Lionheart. So the crusading enthusiasm in the 13th century in England certainly is still very high, and it's seen as the ideal to which someone who's really serious about their chivalry or their knightly status should subscribe. So there's no higher calling still than to go east and fight for the recovery of the Holy Land. As you indicate, what one of the problems is, it's very expensive. As if you are the son of a king and you are taking a retinue of several hundred people, you are essentially footing the bill, or footing a lot of the bills for those people. So you're having to find the ships, you're having to find the horses, you're having to find the accommodation wherever they go. So the cost of Edward's crusade runs well into 6 figures. Annual income of the king is only 5 figures. It's only about 26,000 pounds a year. So it's almost inconceivable sums of money. And Edward does go. He does, I mean, to his credit, he gets as far as the Holy Land, but when he gets there, he discovers that his resources, substantial as they are meager in comparison to those of his Muslim opponents. So it's not it's not the most exciting of crusades. He can't really do much in the way of fighting. The excitement comes at its conclusion in 1272, when an assassin, literally an assassin, tries to take out Edward I, or Edward as he is at the time, and stabs him in the shoulder or the arm with a blade that they, or rather he survives that assassination attempt and starts to head home in the autumn of 1272. And when he's halfway across the Mediterranean, on the island of Sicily, he learns that his father, Henry III, has finally died. So he's king. He's king from that moment. He's king. He's perhaps I can't speak with any great certainty here, but he's perhaps the only king of England who discovers that he's become king whilst he's in Sicily.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about titles as well, because that will be a little bit of obsession with Edward as well, and the changes in, of course, are very, very keen on making up if I may be so bold, to make up meaningless titles, and he had quite a few titles already, but none that was truly his. So if I remember correctly, he is the one who come up with the idea of being the Prince of Wales, so that's still used to this day for the succession for the crown.
Well, it's not quite simple. I mean, what happens with if we'll move on to talk about Wales, perhaps. What happens in the case of Wales is rulers of Wales had the many different rulers of Wales. So Wales isn't a single polity; it's a galaxy of smaller polities. And the rulers of Wales, back in the 11th century, many of them had self-described as kings. But as time wore on, it became increasingly ludicrous, to sort of put it bluntly, for men who were rulers of very tiny polities to describe themselves as rex. So they start to wear new hats. This is the rulers of Wales themselves, and one of the titles that they land upon is princeps, prince. So you get people in the 12th century talking about being Prince of North Wales or Prince of South Wales, and what happens towards the end of Henry III's reign in 1267, after the Montfortian Civil War, is one of those princes, the most powerful, Llewellyn ap Griffith, who is Prince of Gwynedd, is recognised by Henry III as Prince of Wales. So not Prince of North Wales or not Prince of South Wales, but Prince of Wales. And he was the first Welsh ruler, Llewellyn, not just to use that title, but to have that title recognised by the English crown. So that's when the Prince of Wales becomes a thing. What, of course, happens after that is this is when Llewellyn is at the peak of his power. When Edward returns from his crusade in 1274 and is now King of England, he very quickly kind of crosses swords with Llewellyn, and this has been a dispute that's been brewing for the duration of his crusade. So in the 4 years he's been out of England, there's been constant friction between the English lords on the Welsh border and Llewellyn himself. So Edward comes back, and there are all these accumulated grievances, which, that with more goodwill on both sides, perhaps could have been resolved. But I would say probably by the time Edward gets back, they've reached a tipping point by which, without some enormous climb down on one or other of their parts, it was tending towards war. And war is declared on Wales late in 1276, and Edward sort of goes into Wales in the summer of 1277.
So how does this war work out for Edward? Is this when Wales become vassals of England after this point?
Yeah, I mean, this is the point where Wales is kind of ultimately finally conquered, because the conquest of Wales has been a very long, drawn out process, starting immediately after 1066, precisely because it was not just a single country, but, as I say, lots and lots of small independent rulers, and it's very difficult terrain to conquer Wales because the majority of it is upland, and there's two things that follow from that. One is a lot of it isn't very profitable in terms of land. So there's not much, there's no desire on the part of the English/French to conquer mountains. They're looking for the fertile parts. And two, because it's so mountainous or so hilly, it's very difficult to get the armies in and to communicate between various parts of Wales. So the conquest of Wales is kind of largely driven by private baronial enterprise. North Wales has always been the sort of the most powerful of these polities and the most difficult to conquer and the most distant from England. As I say, having crossed swords with Llewellyn, Edward decides. I think he's bent on total conquest from the outset. His first campaign, he gets to a point where it's impractical to continue it, so he leaves Llewellyn in place in 1277. Then 4.5 years later, there is a big rebellion against the new English political settlement in Wales. And at that point, Edward does go for broke and drives huge armies into Wales. Llewellyn is killed in December 1282, and his brother Dafydd captured and killed a few months later. And so at that point, the English overrun North Wales, and famously, Edward cements that conquest with a string of spectacular new castles, which still today ranked as the most spectacular in Europe. So places like Conwy, Harlech, Carnarvon, and then after 1294, Beaumaris. So this is from Edward's point of view, one of the great success stories of his reign. You know, Welsh independence has finally been crushed and Wales has been annexed. As his reign goes on from that point, it's less successful when it comes to foreign policy.
I want to talk about, before we move on to the next topic, I want to talk about some of the law stuff, because that's one of the things Edward I is known for, and that's the laws he pointed out. Though, as you point out, he's known for them, but it's not necessarily that he is the one who made them, though he is the one who got credit for these laws. And that is just the laws supposedly made by Edward I.
Yeah, as you say, he's for a long time been regarded as being a great lawgiver. It was in the 17th century, I think, that he was dubbed the English Justinian, after the 6th century Roman emperor who codified Roman law. So when you look at the English statute book, a lot of the laws start with Edward I, and there are a great number of statutes promulgated in Edward's reign. From the very start of his reign, he starts with a very large coronation-style charter called the Statute of Westminster, and then there's any number of statutes that follow. I mean, perhaps I was a bit unfair on Edward in the introduction to the book. I said it is hard to prove Edward's personal involvement in any of the statute making. So, you know, you can't, it's perhaps an exaggeration to imagine him sort of like being a legalistic king himself. He had plenty of other business to be getting on with, but he was very good at choosing competent ministers who could push through these kind of reforms. And I think he almost certainly did take an interest. But that's the sort of one of the good things about his reign from an English point of view is after the chaos and the political disruption of Henry III's reign, Edward brought a great measure of stability to English government. And it sounds like a hard sell, because the stuff that Edward is best remembered for is the warmongering, is the invasion of neighboring countries. But from the point of view of England and the English, as I say, he brought a great deal of stability and seems to have been concerned with providing good government, providing swift justice. Again, here he's the heir of the idealism that had been around in his youth in the late 1250s and 1260s, when there had been a constant string of complaints about the corruption, especially at a local level, the corruption of Henry III's government among sheriffs and foresters and justices. Edward was very intolerant of that and does seem to have struggled to provide kind of good government for his subjects in England.
I want to talk about the Jews as well. Is a topic in discussion, of course, under Edward's reign. And though they suffered heavily under King John, of course, they would be completely. I would say that somewhat suffered under King Edward I's reign as well, because they were expelled completely from England under his reign.
Yeah, and so I mean we'll do a bit of backstory here. So the Jewish communities in England had first arrived soon after the conquest at the suggestion or the invitation of William the Conqueror. And they had this kind of curious relationship with the English crown, which was on the one hand, they were protected by the crown because they were moneylenders to the king, who the king could draw on for credit whenever he needed. And at the same time, they were, whilst they were dependent on the crown, they were also, well, they were exploited by the crown as moneylenders. So their wealth was more or less at the sort of the king's whim or the king's discretion. They are almost from the first persecuted because they are the only other, if you like, in English society. It's a society which was ostensibly everyone was Christian. They are the sort of the only non-Christian group within English society, and so they are, and as moneylenders as well, they are the object of um, um, persecution. And I think that sort of intolerance towards the Jewish community it spreads as much as the Jewish community itself does. So I don't think there's necessarily an escalation in anti-Semitism. But England is a very anti-Semitic country from the first. And as you say, in King John's reign, they're heavily persecuted. In Henry III's reign, they continue to be persecuted, at least to the extent that they are punished very heavily in terms of the amount of tax that Henry III extracts from them. And so by the time you get to Edward I's reign, what had been a fairly prosperous community is a fairly impoverished one. And without sort of drilling down through all the detail of Edward's reign, he tries various ways of getting more money out of that impoverished community until he gets to 1290, at which point he proposes expelling the Jews from England in return for a tax from Parliament. And this is he borrowed this idea. This is an idea he borrowed, it seems, from one of his cousins on the continent, Charles of Anjou. But it was a final way of extracting more money, not by impoverishing, not by taxing the Jews themselves, but by taxing the Christian majority in his country and saying, if I expel the Jews, what will you pay me in return? And he gets the biggest tax of the English Middle Ages, which really underlines the fact that although this was very
Sorry, you froze. You froze a little bit right now, so I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, just a second. I don't know what's going on. I'm so sorry if there's technical issues. There seems one of us seem to have a poor internet connection. I don't know if you can hear me, but you seem to have frozen in time. So I'm so sorry for any technical difficulties. I really just gonna wait and hope we come back to life soon. There we go.
yeah. So
I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. We had some slightly issues with the Wi-Fi at the moment, but we are back. Now, then we don't have too much time, but we don't have time to discuss everything, of course, unfortunately, as much as we'd like to. One of the perhaps what he's known for, and with a certain movie called Braveheart, we will discuss that one later, of course. We gotta discuss the Scottish Trolls as well, of course.
yeah, well, we've talked about Wales, so we should properly move on to Scotland. I think, and Braveheart is not a bad place to launch from, since it's the version of the story that most people know. And I think there are many things. I mean, we could do a whole podcast sort of, laying into Braveheart and its
Oh, please,
historical
let's do.
well, maybe another time, Erlend. But but if there's one great fiction in the middle of Braveheart, it comes in the middle of the film when William Wallace, who is of course played by Mel Gibson, rides up to the English lines and says, they try and buy him off. What would you like? Would you like land? Would you like gold? And he says what he wants is for them to ride back to England, passing through stopping in every village they pass to apologize for 100 years of rape, pillage, and slaughter. Now, that's the great lie at the heart of Braveheart, because prior to Edward I's intervention military intervention in 1296, England and Scotland had been getting on really well, like a house on fire. So whereas there had been a constant antagonism with between the English and the Welsh, between the English and the Scots, not at all. And by any number of measures, you can see the English and the Scots getting on well. So there were, for example, Edward's Edward's sister and Edward's aunt. They were both married to Scottish rulers, Scottish kings. There are numerous earls in England. So the Earl of Norfolk, the Earl of Kent, the Earl of Gloucester, they are also married to Scottish princesses or Scottish noblewomen. There are English monastic houses in northern England who are sending monks into Scotland to set up daughter houses in Scotland. There are English merchants moving north into Scotland from England to set up shop, literally, in Scottish burghs or towns. So Scotland, at least the southern part, is some people would, you might say, Anglicizing or Europeanizing, but Scotland is becoming part of the mainstream in the 13th century in a way that Wales not so much. So in a way, you could have imagined a much more peaceful outcome to that process of acculturization. And that was that was what was on the cards as down to as far as 1290, because in the 1280s, the Scots got themselves into a huge dynastic difficulty in that the King of Scots' sons died one by one. And then he set off to try and remedy this deficit of sons by marrying a new young French bride, and fell off his horse en route to see her during a storm. So we ended up with a situation in which the heir to the Scottish throne is a 6-year-old girl, the daughter of the King of Norway and the granddaughter of the King of Scots, who's called Margaret, the Maid of Norway. The plan was at that point to have her marry Edward I's son, the future Edward II. And had that happened, you would have got a union of the crowns there and then in the late 13th century. You wouldn't have had to wait until 1603. And had it happened in 1290 rather than 1603, it would have been a much happier union, because the English and the Scots wouldn't have spent those next 3 centuries knocking 7 bells out of each other. But it didn't happen because the Maid of Norway died en route to Scotland. But Edward couldn't let the idea of England obtaining Scotland go. So he contrived over the next several years to browbeat Scotland into accepting his overlordship. And when they finally rose up in rebellion against him in 1295, he decided he would conquer Scotland outright. So Scotland was going to be Wales Mark II. And this was the great failure of his reign, because Scotland is a lot bigger than Wales. I don't think Edward necessarily appreciated this. He'd been up to Scotland a couple of times. He'd seen lowland Scotland, but Scotland, if you conceive of Scotland as it is today, Scotland is 1/3 of the landmass of Britain, whereas Wales is less than 10%. So he bit off a great deal more than he could chew. And also, the Scots had a much greater sense of being united as a people than the Welsh ever did. Scotland was, by the late 13th century, one polity and one community against which he was contending. So he was ultimately very unsuccessful. He thought he'd done it. By the end of his reign in 1305, the Scots had submitted, and Scotland, at least in Edward's official documents, had been demoted from a kingdom to a land. He starts referring to it not as a regnum, but as a terram or terra. But the sort of conclusion to the story is well known. In Edward's final months, Scotland, in the form of Robert Bruce, comes roaring back. Bruce declares himself King of Scots, has himself invested at Scone as king. And ultimately, the Scots vindicate their right to nationhood. They beat the English in battle in 1314. This is after Edward's died, and famously declare that as long as there are 100 of them left alive, they will never submit to the dominion of the King of England. So, as I say, that's the great mistake that Edward concludes his reign with, is trying to conquer Scotland.
I don't ask the historical inaccuracies, as I say, we don't discuss Braveheart as a film in another episode. But the historical inaccuracies here. What did you think about? I'm trying to say his name right here, Patrick McGoohan, as to put his portrayal of Edward I in the movie.
Well, I mean, Patrick McGoohan, I mean, he's called upon to play the villain in that film, and it is from let's be blunt here, from the Scottish point of view, Edward I is a dyed-in-the-wool villain. There's no question. The things he does to the Scots, against the Scots, are villainous. He fits that mold very well. That said, you know, McGoohan's portrayal is of a moustache-twirling villain, you know, complete autocrat. Someone who, you know, the famous instances, you know, where in the film where he says, you know, let the archers shoot, and someone says, well, won't they hit our own troops? And he says, yes, but they'll hit the Scots as well. You know, so someone who's absolutely unconcerned even about the lives of his own men. Someone who in the film throws his son's boyfriend out of a castle window. You know, these are scenes invented to demonize Edward I and to make the audience boo and hiss when he's on screen, with no foundation in reality whatsoever. You know, so there's Edward I is a very interesting king, because at the time of his death in 1307, he was lauded by chroniclers as a Rex Magnus, a great king, and not just by obituarists in Westminster, you know, the kind of place you'd expect him to get a good write-up. He is called a great king even by Irish chroniclers, people on the other side of the cultural divide, recognizing his impact on all the peoples of Britain and Ireland. But he was also, by his Westminster obituaries, called a terrible king because, and this is the phrasing of the annalist, he says, to the sons of pride, i.e. to his enemies, to those who opposed him, he was a terrible king, meaning he was a king who inflicted great terror, a terrifying king, if you like. So that, I mean, that's why I ended up calling my book A Great and Terrible King, because he is this curious mix of, on the one hand, the good and the great, and on the other hand, the terrible. And it seems contradictory to modern ears to describe something as great and terrible. But for contemporaries, people who lived under Edward I's rule, it was, and especially to English contemporaries, being great and being terrible were not contradictory aspects of his character. It was an integral part of what made him great, was being terrible. The ability to go after his enemies with fire and sword was part of his greatness. So it goes to show that people 700 years ago had very different ideas to us about what constituted government.
And same as we think of type, we kind of, in my opinion, when we think of people as the great, I discussed this with a mate of mine a while ago, you know, just because it seemed to me this just that how people title great, just because, well, they killed a lot of people and they are considered great leaders. We should really begin to rethink the title, the great in general, of people. Should they deserve the title, the great, or should they, you know, should they really be labeled in the modern era as people of antiquity label people the great, or early modernity? Should the title the great still be applied to certain people? You know, it's kind of the same there.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, sometimes people are accorded the title great by later historians. I mean, some titles are just made up in the 18th, 19th century, and there's no reason, they're just inventions. The thing that's interesting about Edward I is I didn't choose to call him great. Contemporaries described him as great. And in fact, some contemporaries went further and described him as Edward the Good, Edward the Conqueror, Edward the Bold. So this is contemporary praise that's heaped upon Edward. And Yeah, so I think when phrases are used with contemporary warrant, it doesn't mean that we have to endorse them or buy into them. But this is things that were said about them at the time. The other thing, just to focus on the word great, is great doesn't necessarily mean good. A lot
Yeah.
of the time it's used in that way. Great just means, in the sense of awesome, or
Yeah.
just in the sense of having a huge impact.
I
That
mean,
is the word that's used of
I mean,
Edward the First.
to be fair, Peter the Great was called great, but he was a terrible person. He had a terrible personality. You wouldn't want to be friends with him, to put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, what I was going to mention was that the Irish chronicler who describes Edward as great says, in this year, Edward the Great, King of the English, died. In his time, the most men fell. So it's not great as in good, but it's great in terms of like, oh my God, the impact.
Mm.
The most people died in his reign as a consequence of this man's wars and conquests and actions. So yeah, you can and perhaps should use great dispassionately, in that way. It's not great does not equal good.
Mm. I want to ask before we ran off, because you mentioned, and I don't remember which son this was, but you mentioned that the homosexual, that one of his son was a homosexual. Is there ten in the movie Braveheart? Was the Do we know if one of his sons were in real life as well, or is this just fiction on the Braveheart's part?
It's very difficult. I mean, the short answer is it's very difficult to determine someone's sexuality at the distance of 700 years. That said, the way in which Edward II behaves throughout his reign, and the constant succession of favourites he has, beginning with Piers Gaveston, and moving on to the Despensers later in his reign, um, suggests that, yeah, I mean, Edward II almost certainly gay, as we would understand it, but not necessarily as it was understood then. But I mean. Yeah, so I mean that much of Braveheart is nods to reality. Um, yeah.
I think we're gonna round it up there. We are unfortunately running out of time. But before I go, of course, where can people find you on social media if they have further questions about Edward the First or any other books that you have written, of course, because you've written quite a few books on English history, and among them, of course, that Great and Terrible King. Where can people find this book if they want to read it for themselves and learn more about Edward the First, and of course, anything else you want to promote, links you want to put in the description, or yeah, anything you want me to share.
No, I think we covered most of the bases there. I mean, obviously, Edward the First, he enjoyed a very long reign of 35 years, and he did a great deal more. I mean, we didn't touch on any of his relations with France, and his 4 years or 5 years in Gascony. So there's much more to know about him. But yeah, as you said, it's all chronicled in the book.
Mm. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great pleasure to have you back. Of course, we gotta discuss Braveheart at some point, and it will be great to have you back for that. And this has been with that as well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars, or you can give us one. So it would be preferable if you give us higher stars. On this side of the world, it's a free country, so you can rank us however much you like. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, consider writing a review. That will help us out a lot. Please like, share, and subscribe if you are on YouTube or any other platforms. This has been Anand. This has been with that as well. My name is Anand. I'll see you next time.